Welcome to Truthology, a journey into the very essence of truth. In this series, we'll explore the fundamental mysteries of life's origin and meaning. How did we get here? Where did we come from? What brought us into existence? What is our relationship to reality as a whole? Sometimes I wonder why anyone talks about anything else. Because this is the most interesting topic in the world. If you're listening to this, and you think that knowing the answers to these questions with certainty, to really have proof, is impossible, all I can say is stay tuned. I made this series just for you, so you can see, know, and judge the evidence for yourself. Welcome to Truthology.
Hello, and welcome to Truthology. I'm your host, Jeffrey Libby. In the last section, we went over the scientific proof that the universe and all life within it was created by a creator, designed by a designer, and most assuredly is not the product of random chance or accident. At this point, then, the obvious question that we're faced with is who is the creator? And that's the question we're going to address in this section. Jesus Christ claimed to be that creator, and in this section, I'm going to show you the historical proof that he actually was the creator. The more the claim that I can prove this shocks you, the more you think that Christianity is simply a fairy tale and isn't based on historical fact, the more I encourage you to examine the evidence that I'm about to present. Let's start off with an outline of how we'll go about this inquiry. First, we'll look at the question of whether Jesus even existed as a real historical figure or not. Second, we'll ask the question, how can we prove anything that happened in the remote past? Third, we'll look at what Jesus claimed about himself. Did he assert himself to be a wise teacher, a prophet, or God incarnate? Fourth, we'll look at the hard evidence that even the most skeptical, non-Christian scholars accept and see if we can prove, beyond any reasonable doubt, who Jesus really was. Finally, we'll look at the alternate theories and objections to see if they can hold water. So, with that said, let's get right to it, shall we? It may come as a shock to some of you who are hearing this, but many people today, be they barroom theologians or New Age hippies, will actually assert that Jesus never existed. They'll say that Jesus was just made up as some sort of a grand scheme to gain power and wealth. Of course, no scholars, even secular ones, would ever make such a preposterous claim that Jesus never lived. They'd be laughed off campus. However, as I said, in social circles and the cesspools of social media, I hear this view espoused with surprising frequency. Therefore, let's start by just taking a quick sort of machine gun survey of some quotes to put our finger on the pulse, to give you an overview, if you will, of what people whose career is studying history, both Christians and non-Christians alike, have to say about this question of whether Jesus was a real figure in history or not. We'll start with Professor Bart Ehrman from the University of North Carolina, who says, and I quote, "I don't think there's any serious historian who doubts the existence of Jesus. We have more evidence for Jesus than we have for almost anybody from this time period," end quote. Next, Marcus Borg, professor of religion and culture at Oregon State University, says, and I quote, "Some judgments are so probable as to be certain. For example, Jesus really existed and he really was crucified, just as Julius Caesar really existed and was assassinated. We can know in fact as much about Jesus as we can about any figure in the ancient world," end quote. Next, we have Richard Burridge, professor of biblical interpretation from King's College in London, who says, and I quote, "There are those who argue that Jesus is a figment of the church's imagination, that there never was a Jesus at all. I have to say that I don't know any respectable critical scholar who says that anymore," end quote. Next, Marcus Casey from Nottingham University says in response to that question, and I quote, "This view that Jesus didn't exist is demonstrably false. It is fueled by a regrettable form of atheist prejudice, which holds all the main primary sources and Christian people in contempt. Most of its proponents are also extraordinarily incompetent," end quote. Next, Rudolf Bultmann writes, and I quote, "By no means are we at the mercy of those who doubt or deny that Jesus ever lived," end quote. Next, the late Michael Grant, the eminent historian of the Roman Empire, writes in his book, Jesus, A Historian's Review of the Gospels, and I quote, "In recent years, no serious scholar has ventured to postulate the non-historicity of Jesus, or at any rate very few, and they have not succeeded in disposing of the much stronger, indeed very abundant evidence to the contrary," end quote. The late Graham Stanton of Cambridge University says, and I quote, "Today, nearly all historians, whether Christian or not, accept that Jesus existed and that the Gospels contain plenty of valuable evidence which has to be weighed and assessed critically," end quote. N.T. Wright of Oxford and St. Andrews Universities in The Guardian said, and I quote, "The historical evidence for Jesus himself is extraordinarily good. From time to time, people try to suggest that Jesus of Nazareth never existed, but virtually all historians of whatever background now agree that he did," end quote. Darrell Bock, the New Testament scholar of Dallas Theological Seminary, said, and I quote, "Though they disliked and may have even wanted to get rid of Christians, there is no evidence that those who opposed the movement attributed to him denied his existence," end quote. Professor Casey Eldridge of Gustavus Adolphus College holds this view of early non-Christian sources, including Tacitus, Josephus, and Suetonius, and I quote, "The testimonies of ancient historians offer strong evidence against a purely mythical reading of Jesus. In contrast to those who have denied the historical evidence of Jesus altogether, judging him merely to have been a mythological construct of early Christian thought, the testimonies of the ancient historians reveal how even those outside of the early church regarded Jesus to have been a historical person. It remains difficult, therefore, if not impossible, to deny the historical existence of Jesus when the earliest Christian, Jewish, and pagan evidence mention him." End quote. Agnostic Bible scholar Bart Ehrman says, and I quote, "We are not dealing with just one gospel that says what Jesus said and did from sometime near the end of the first century. We have a number of surviving gospels. I named 7 that are either completely independent of one another or independent in a large number of their traditions. These all attest to the existence of Jesus. Moreover, these independent witnesses corroborate many of the same basic sets of data. For example, that Jesus not only lived, but that he was a Jewish teacher that was crucified by the Romans at the instigation of Jewish authorities in Jerusalem. The vast network of these traditions, numerically significant, widely dispersed, and largely independent of one another, makes it almost certain that whatever one wants to say about Jesus, at the very least, one must say that he existed." End quote. Princeton University scholar James Charlesworth said, and I quote, "It would be foolish to continue to foster the illusion that the Gospels are merely fictional stories like the legends of Hercules. And the references to Jesus by a Roman historian and a Jewish historian disprove the absurd contention that Jesus never lived." Now, of course, we don't want to fall prey to the logical fallacy called argumentum ad populum, or appeal to the people in Latin. This fallacy, also sometimes known as the appeal to popularity, or argument from consensus, or also the bandwagon fallacy, is the fallacious argument that a consensus of opinion defines the truth. While the consensus alone does not define truth, it's nonetheless important for you to understand the fact that the overwhelming majority of scholars of ancient history would never question the fact that Jesus actually existed as a historical figure. The reason why these scholars would never question the existence of Jesus, as summarized in the quote above from Ehrman and others, is because we have so many independent sources of information on his life from disparate nations and people groups like the Romans, Jews, Greeks, and others. Let's now look at the historical evidence that causes these scholars to all assert Jesus' historicity so unanimously and with such strong conviction. You should also understand that when it comes to other figures in ancient history, if historians have anything more than one source, they feel they've hit the historical lottery, so to speak. When it comes to Jesus, to start, here's a list of 17 all non-Christian sources of information on Jesus' life from the great Dr. Gary Habermas in his book, Ancient Evidence for the Life of Jesus. Habermas's book documents the outline of the life and death of Jesus as attested by a multiplicity of non-Christian sources, as follows, with the year written in parentheses. Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus, Thallus, Pliny the Younger, Emperor Trajan, Emperor Hadrian, the Jewish Talmud, Toledith Jesu, Lucian, Mara Bar Sepian, the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John, the Gospel of Thomas, the Treatise on Resurrection, the Acts of Pontius Pilate, Phlegon, and in total, Dr. Gary Habermas lists 45 sources, the 17 non-Christian sources I just named, 5 early church fathers, 19 creedal statements, and 4 archaeological sources. Now, of course, Jesus' mere existence in history is far from all we're aiming to prove in this section. So, let's take a moment to look at what we are claiming about Jesus, what other people claim about him, and what he claimed about himself. Then, we can look at these claims and see if there are factual and evidentiary bases for them. As we've seen above, there are some who, despite all the evidence to the contrary, still deny Jesus' existence entirely and believe him only to be a mythological character. Others, like New Agers and barroom theologians, claim that while of course Jesus existed, he was just a great teacher and nothing more. Others, like the Jews for example, do not deny that Jesus worked miracles, but instead claim that the force behind those miracles was not God, but the devil. We see that in Matthew chapter 12, verse 24, which says, and I quote, "But when the Pharisees heard it, they said, 'This fellow doth not cast out devils, but by Beelzebub, the prince of the devils,'" end quote. So you can see here that the Pharisees, or Jewish leaders, are not denying that Jesus performed miracles. They're saying that his miracles were done by the power of Beelzebub, or the devil. Still others, like the Muslims and the Baha'is, claim that Jesus was not God, but rather just one more in the line of many great prophets throughout history. As we start to address these claims of who Jesus really was, we must quote C.S. Lewis, who said in his masterpiece, Mere Christianity, and I quote, "I am trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to." End quote. What Lewis is saying, to be crystal clear, is that Jesus and his followers after him claimed unequivocally that he is the Son of God, that is, God manifested in human flesh. Jesus explicitly and adamantly claimed to be Jehovah, or the God of the Old Testament, creator of the entire universe, the one and only God who created and rules the entire universe, and the only one who can forgive sin. Sometimes when I'm talking with people about this, especially the ones who, you know the type, have to object to literally everything, they'll blurt out questions like, well, did Jesus really even claim to be God? To me, this seems pretty obvious because the entire history of Jesus was that he claimed to be God incarnate. And it was for that crime, which was called blasphemy in the old days, that Jesus, as a matter of historical record, was convicted and crucified. Without belaboring the point, let's run through a few quick examples of Jesus directly claiming to be God, just so we're crystal clear that, in point of fact, that is what he claimed about himself. First he said, and I quote, "I am the first and the last," which, by the way, was the same exact words used by God in the Old Testament in Isaiah 42, verse 8. Another quote, Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." And that's from John 8:58. And there was no question of what Jesus meant by this claim, as evidenced by the fact that when he said it, the Jews around him immediately picked up stones to kill him for blasphemy. They understood exactly what he was saying and what he meant, and I hope that you do too. We also see this same thing in Mark 14, which records Jesus' trial. And I quote, "Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, 'Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?' But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, 'Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?' 'I am,' said Jesus, 'and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven.' The high priest tore his clothes. 'Why do we need any more witnesses?' he asked. 'You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?' End quote. Yet another example is from John 10:33, when Jesus' enemies said directly that they wanted to stone him, quote, 'because you, a mere man, claim to be God.' I could give 100 examples of how Jesus claimed to be God, but there's no reason to belabor the point. Anyone who simply reads the Gospels, or even has heard those few examples we just reviewed, understands that Jesus clearly and unequivocally claimed to be God in human flesh. Of course, the fact that Jesus claimed to be God does not prove that he actually was God. However, we should now at least be crystal clear that, in point of indisputable fact, Jesus did claim to be God incarnate. With that established, let's now look at the question of how we can prove if Jesus' claim that he was God is actually true or not. If God is an immaterial being, how could we prove or disprove his identity based on empirical evidence? To answer that question, imagine for a moment you were out meeting a friend for lunch, and right as you sat down, he said, "I have something big to tell you. It's been on my mind and it's very important." "Sure," you say, "anything. What is it?" "I'm God," he replies. "Okay," so you ask, Did you just get back from a yoga retreat or reading some New Age book? Are you saying God is everything and everything is God, or something along those lines? No, your friend emphatically states, I am Jehovah, the God of the Old Testament, creator of the universe and everything in it. Okay, you hesitantly reply. Could you prove it? Your friend says, sure, I'm God. I'll do anything you want. Just ask me. Well, I don't know, you say. No one's ever asked me to help them prove they're God before. Now, let's say your friend says, well, I happen to have these dice in my pocket, and I guarantee you I can roll 7 or 11 10 times in a row. Well, that would be impressive, you reply, and your friend proceeds to roll 7 10 times in a row. After thinking about it for a minute, you say, hey, let me see those dice. And lo and behold, you notice that the only numbers on them are 2s and 5s, guaranteeing they'll roll a 7 every single time. Clearly, this does not prove that your friend is God. So then, if rolling dice is not sufficient, then how could this friend of yours prove their claim to be God? What would you ask them to do in order to prove to you with certainty that they are indeed God? If you ask me, the most valid proof of this claim would be if your friend said, okay, here's how I'm going to prove that I'm really God. You're going to watch me be brutally murdered, die, and be buried right before your eyes. Then, 3 days later, I'm going to come back to life in the flesh, hang out with you, have conversations, and eat meals together. If your friend said that to you, I suspect you would reply, well, I don't want to see you get murdered right before my eyes, but if you did, and then came back to life and sat here and had lunch with me, then of course you will have proven your claim to be God. So the moral of the story is that the claim to be God incarnate is a tough one to substantiate. The best way I or anyone else could ever think of to prove that claim would be to be murdered and then physically come back to life. Therefore, in order to assess Jesus' claim of divinity, we must look at the claim that he was in fact murdered and then physically resurrected. If this did not happen, then he is a fraud and he is not God. Conversely, if we can prove in fact that Jesus was physically resurrected from the dead, then we can be certain that his claims to be God were proven. This is not a theory I made up. It's plainly obvious. For example, the Apostle Paul was keenly aware of this and addresses the issue head-on in the Bible in his letter to the Corinthians, where he writes, and I quote, "And if Christ had not been raised, our preaching is worthless, and so is your faith. In that case, we are also exposed as false witnesses about God. For we have testified about God that he raised Christ from the dead, but he did not raise him if in fact the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If our hope in Christ is for this life alone, then we are to be pitied more than all men." End quote. To Put the cookies on the bottom shelf, as the old saying goes. The key issue we're dealing with here is Jesus' physical resurrection from the dead. As both C.S. Lewis and the Apostle Paul pointed out above, the resurrection of Jesus either literally, historically, and physically happened, in which case Jesus is God, or it was a complete fraud and a lie. The one thing it cannot be, however, is both. So now, how are we going to go about analyzing if Jesus really was resurrected or not? To answer that question, it's helpful to ask how we can determine if anything in the distant past is true. For example, how do we know that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon? Or how do we know Alexander the Great really lived? In a court of law, we can find someone guilty of murder and sentence them to death. The verdict, upon which a human life is hinged, is not based on mathematical certainty, but rather on a preponderance of evidence. While we can never have a mathematical certainty about events in the past, we can prove a case beyond any reasonable doubt. We can create a burden of proof for which there is no other reasonable explanation that can come from the evidence presented. As we'll be looking at things that happened a long time ago, let's review some of the different types of evidence that historical scholars use to know if things did happen in the ancient past. Then, we'll talk about others along the way as we encounter them. The first one is early testimony. It practically goes without saying, but of course, the closer the testimony is to the event, the more reliable it is likely to be. For example, if we were looking into the assassination of John F. Kennedy, a testimony given the day of the shooting would likely be more reliable than, for example, asking our now 90-year-old grandparents what they remember about that day. Needless to say, they are now old, it happened a long time ago, and their memories may have faded. So in examining historical facts, less time also prevents exaggerations and legends from creeping into the story. Therefore, it's common sense that testimony from a point in time closer to an event is more reliable than testimony from a time further away from an event. When we're talking about early testimony, let's remember that Jesus died around 30 AD. When we look at the dating of the New Testament documents, for example, 1 Thessalonians in 50 AD, Mark in 70 AD, Matthew 80 AD, Luke 85 AD, John 95 to 100 AD, some people say, oh, come on now. Those sources are 20 to 70 years later. But let's look at secular history by comparison. For example, let's look at Alexander the Great as an example of a biography that would correspond to the Gospels, except for Alexander. The earliest sources we have for Alexander the Great are from 280 years after he died. Of course, no secular historian would ever deny the existence of Alexander the Great. And in fact, in Alexander's case, while the earliest source is from 280 years after his death, the best sources are Plutarch and Arrian, who wrote 425 to 450 years, or almost half a millennium after Alexander died. In summary, we want early sources and all the sources that we're looking at in relation to the resurrection of Christ are far earlier than those accepted by secular scholars in relation to other historical figures. For this reason, Christian scholars have often said that if you don't accept the evidence for the resurrection of Christ, you cannot accept any evidence from ancient history, because nothing else is so well and recently attested as the life of Jesus. Number two, we're looking for eyewitness testimony. The second criterion we're always going after is, of course, eyewitness testimony. Again, let's use the example of the JFK assassination. The testimony of someone from the day of events would be valuable, but let's say we had one witness who was on the scene in Dallas and another witness who read about the events in the newspaper. Clearly, the eyewitness testimony is more valuable and credible. As we go through the evidence of Jesus' resurrection, you'll see how often we're relying on the testimony of direct eyewitnesses and those who had direct personal contact with the eyewitnesses. Number three, multiple and independent sources. In addition to early eyewitness testimony, we're looking to understand the historicity of an event in the past. We're also looking for multiple independent sources. This criteria really needs no further explanation, as everyone knows intuitively that multiple independent sources are more credible than a single independent source. Number four is enemy attestation. In addition to multiple early and eyewitness sources, we're also looking for the testimony of those who could be considered enemies, because people don't make up stories to help their enemies. Therefore, while any testimony is valuable, the testimony of an enemy is particularly valuable because not only don't they have a reason to lie, it's against their interest to lie. Number five is the criterion of embarrassment. Next, in the criterion of embarrassment, which is similar to enemy attestation, this states that if a story causes the source embarrassment, then it's very unlikely, that they made it up. Because, as we all know, people don't like to embarrass themselves. So, in conclusion, when looking at the evidence for this case, we're going to use the same methods and techniques used by all secular historians and judges, like early, independent, eyewitness, enemy, and embarrassing testimony. With that overview of the case and methods we'll use to examine it in place, I'm afraid we're out of time. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Truthology. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode, where we'll apply these techniques as we systematically walk through the specific facts and pieces of evidence related to the life, death, and physical resurrection of Jesus. I'll see you there. Thanks so much for joining me on this episode of Truthology. Please click like to show me that you enjoyed this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any future episodes. Also, please be sure to check out the description below this video to learn how you can get in touch with me, ask me about any subjects you'd like me to cover, join my mailing list, see me at live events, and get involved with the entire Truthology community. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Until then, Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time on Truthology.